I applied to the council before and have become homeless again. Can I go back to the same council for help? And that's a question we've got come through the comments. The short answer is yes, you can. You can essentially make as many homeless applications as you want to, provided they're not based on exactly the same information as the previous one was. Now, there's a few caveats as ever with this, which I'll go into in a little bit more detail. But essentially, it's not an unusual situation. We work with people who, they get placed eventually in private rented accommodation, and then a few years down the line, the landlord wants it back, so they have to reapproach the council. The key thing here, and the term that the Homelessness Code of Guidance uses is this term called fresh application, a fresh homeless application. And in one sense, this is probably a good time just to actually look into the Homelessness Code of Guidance. So if you literally just Google Homelessness Code of Guidance PDF, the very first thing that crops up, if you just click on it, download it, it's a big PDF. And crucially, the good thing about PDFs is you can search them quite easily. So if you just search for the term fresh homeless application or fresh application, you're going to have one of a few options which you can go down to. It's all in chapter 18, which is all about homeless applications itself. And this is the rule book that housing officers have to follow, which is I'll kind of refer to a lot throughout these videos. Now, the key thing here is that the change in facts needs to be of a relevant fact, and I'll explain what that means in a second. This is a topic we cover in the online training I do, and it's based on a case study that we use. So, anonymised case study that we use sometimes, where essentially this guy he's found to be in priority need by the council through various kind of issues he's got, mental health issues, and kind of various historic kind of difficulties he's been through. The council accepts he's in priority need, but they say he's intentionally homeless, and they reach that decision. They then evict him from temporary accommodation, so he's back on the streets. And whilst on the streets, he gets attacked, and he has badly beaten up and has his medication stolen and a few other things as well. So now he's obviously more vulnerable than he was in the first application. So in one sense, his circumstances have changed. But the key thing here is that the change in facts is not relevant to the original decision, because the original decision, they already accepted he was vulnerable. So now that he's more vulnerable, it doesn't actually matter in terms of what duty they owe to him. The key thing here is whether or not he's intentionally homeless. So in order for him to make a fresh application to that council, he would need to obtain some kind of accommodation of some sort that raises the question that if he was to lose it again, whether he would be intentionally homeless. And case law is clear that doesn't necessarily have to be settled accommodation. It does get a bit complicated. So there was a family who basically they were found intentionally homeless. They then remained in the B&B for a year, and they reapproached, and there was this question of whether that change in facts was enough to trigger a fresh application, and the answer it was. So yeah, that's the first thing to say, is that the change in facts has to be relevant. So another example here, just to explain how this would work with priority needs. Hypothetically speaking, let's say I had depression, and I became homeless, and let's say the GP was treating me with 50 milligrams of sertraline or something like that, so quite a low level dose of a common antidepressant. Now I could approach a council, and they might legitimately reach a decision that I'm not vulnerable. They could speak to my GP, and the GP could say, actually, yeah, do you know what, Mike's pretty robust, I don't think there's going to be any significant harm done if he was to become homeless, and I think that's unlikely, but let's just kind of go with that for a second. So the council could legitimately reach the decision that I'm not in priority needs, although again, as I've said elsewhere, depression is enough in itself to make someone in priority need, depending on the facts of the case. But let's say, I then became homeless and my mental health deteriorated, probably pretty predictably. And so I go back to my GP and say, look, I'm feeling even more depressed now. And the GP might, for example, increase my dose of sertraline up to 100 or 200 milligrams or something like that. And he might make referrals to some sort of therapy, for example. I could then go back to the same council and say, look, you said I was not in priority need when I was on 50 milligrams of sertraline. Now I'm on 200 or 100 or whatever. The facts have changed. I'm more depressed than I was before. I'm more vulnerable to harm than I was before. Therefore, we need to accept a fresh application and basically take it from there. So you can kind of go through that process. Now, with this kind of change in relevant facts, it does lead to an interesting kind of way of dealing with homeless applications. So, and again, we've kind of seen this in casework a few times where, you get to the Section 184 decision, and let's say it's negative. You've got a choice here whether you go down the review process or whether you ask for what's called a Section 202 review, which is where you basically appeal that decision. But if the facts have changed, and they often will do, because often that person approached the council months ago, the inquiries were done months ago, and the decision has only just been reached now. And actually, it may be that the facts have changed and they weren't taken into consideration in that final decision. So you've got a choice whether you go down the Section 202 review route, which can lead to a duty to place you in interim accommodation whilst that's going on. Or you can just trigger a fresh application and start from scratch. And again, councils don't like you for it, but it should not be controversial for a homeless person to act in their own interest and to use the law, as long as they're acting lawfully, to use the law for their advantage. That's a point that Jan Luber makes. Now, Jan Luber's a bigwig lawyer, arguably kind of the most senior housing lawyer in the country, or certainly the most respected housing lawyer in the country. He writes the textbook that lots of housing officers have on their desks around homelessness. And he basically makes the point, look, if you get a negative decision from one council, just go to another council. You can do it. The law allows it, so just do it. If that might pragmatically be the best way to deal with negative decisions, rather than going through the review process, rather than kind of going down the route. Just use the law to your advantage and find another way of doing it, because you might get a different response. And it's quite an old case now, so I don't know how this would work slightly differently with the local connection stuff in the HRA, the Homelessness Reduction Act. But basically, there was a couple. They were found to be intentionally homeless by Slough Borough Council. I think the couple separated, but one of them went to Ealing, London Borough Council of Ealing, and they made an application there, and Ealing reached a different decision from what Slough did. So Slough said they were intentionally homeless, or he or she was intentionally homeless. Ealing said they weren't, and they referred them back to Slough, and Slough had to accept that decision from Ealing. So, as I say, there are ways, when you kind of get into it, you can kind of actually use the law quite. I'm not going to say sneakily, but you can use the complexities of the law for your advantage. And as I say, if housing officers get the hump that you're using the law for your advantage, then that's probably a sign that they're not the best housing officer ever, because that's that's within your rights to do it. As long as, I say, you're not lying about stuff or tricking anyone, you can use the law to your advantage. It shouldn't be seen as controversial. So yeah, hopefully that's helpful. If you've made it to this far through the video, please do like and subscribe to all this stuff. And if you've got the inclination to do it, please share this information on other social media platforms. It's a good way to increase our reach. And again, if you've got questions that apply to lots of people, if you put them in the comments section, I will try my best to answer them as quick as I can. It's probably quite a good way of identifying what sort of issues people are having. So yeah, as I say, if you're asking a question specifically about a very unique situation you're in, I probably can't do it. But if you're asking a question like this, which applies to lots of people, it should be pretty straightforward for me to do a video on it. So yeah, hopefully that helps.